We also talked about the business aspect of MMA and how it's affecting young fighters, and is it ethical to fight in MMA at all? And I found your views interesting because there are not many people that even talk about these things with the MMA craze now going on, and the MMA is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I would really like to know your opinion. I would like you to share your opinion with our viewers.
Let me start first by telling you my history with MMA. I was one of the first investors in the UFC. My Rorion Gracie was the one that came up with the UFC concept. A lot of people don't know that. His idea was to showcase Brazilian jiu-jitsu because he found that when he first came to America that very few people knew how to fight really on the ground. There was a saying in jiu-jitsu, if you don't know how to fight on the ground, you don't know how to fight. Because in the Gracie experience, especially in Brazil, where people used to fight a lot. This weekend is the Russian fighter where they do a lot of fighting. In Brazil, they fought just as much as they do in Russia, maybe more, because it's hot and people are really irritable more, And but a lot of the fights ended on the ground all the time. There, they stopped the fights when the fights ended up on the ground. In Brazil, they just kept going. So the guy that could prevail on the ground was going to be the guy that won. So Rorion wanted to showcase this particular style of jiu-jitsu because he realized that people had no concept of what to do. And so he used the smallest, weakest member of the Gracie family. He used the little brother, Royce Gracie, the youngest son of Elio. And Royce was very great skills, but not particularly athletically gifted, very weak. I was his trainer, his personal trainer for the first 4 UFCs. I was just trying to get the guy strong because, he was not strong. And, his weightlifting ability was like laughable almost, truly. And he could barely do, like 4 or 5 chin-ups when I first started working with him. But he had amazing flexibility, great endurance, and that unbelievable skill on the mat. And here was this skinny kid that just shocked the world. People couldn't believe it. A lot of people thought it was fake, really. I know for a fact it was not fake. There was no fixes in those fights. They got the best, highest caliber fighters that they could at the time. They were on a shoestring budget. They had very little money to... And then the thing kind of folded after the Dan Severn fight because it went overtime, and they had to blank out the pay-per-view because it went over the pay-per-view time that they had, and the fight was still going on because there was no time limits. It was the closest thing to a real street fight. There was no gloves. You could not wrap your hands. So if you didn't know how to hit, you'd break your hand, and a lot of guys would break their hand. There was groin shots allowed. You could knee or kick or punch to the groin. You could pull hair. You could pretty much do everything. You could hit with the point of the elbow. You could hit with the elbow in the back of the neck and the head. You could kick from any position. You could stomp a guy when he was down. You could kick when the guy was down. It's very brutal, man. And anything went. The only thing people didn't do was bite and poke in the eyes. But pretty much...
And fish hook.
And fish hook. That was it, man. It's about as close to a street fight as you're going to get. But, it was a little brutal. And Senator John McCain tried to enact legislation to have it banned. And it looked like it was going to go. So at that point, I pulled my money out. I got my investment back. Didn't make a lot of money, but at least I got the money back I put in. And the show was sold. And then a couple years later, it came back in a different form, where there was very strict rules, many of the dangerous things that they allowed originally. They had time limits. They definitely allowed hand wrapping, gloves, which changed the whole nature of the fight. Truth be known, if it went back to the old rules, grapplers would win every single fight. Mostly, probably the jiu-jitsu guys would win everything. Jiu-jitsu is such a patient martial art, and all the fights would be on the ground, and the jiu-jitsu guy would prevail.
But the wrestlers had the great advantage with the headbutting.
There's no doubt that they did. There used to be a big rivalry between wrestlers and jiu-jitsu guys in Brazil with no gi, but jiu-jitsu guys even prevailed over those wrestlers. But it takes a long time, man. And I don't think an audience would sit and watch a 2-hour fight because it takes that long sometimes just to make the guy tired enough that you can get him, especially when he's wet and slippery and so forth. But, be that as it may, the fight changed. It was a completely different model. They did a great marketing job with it. And it was shocking to me the amount of abuse that the guys would take. You've worn the MMA gloves. You could punch through a wall with those things. The gloves were added in there to not only protect the hand of the guy punching, but to make for more spectacular knockouts, because people want to see blood and they want to see knockouts. And it makes for a great show. Beautiful, violent show. Incredibly violent.
And you don't agree with that anymore?
Now that I analyze this and I look at this, I feel that it's almost like they get these young kids in there and really stir it up. They make very little money. Even top guys, I know this for a fact, that even the top champs are barely making $90,000 for a fight. Once they actually win and become champion, then they get a percentage of the pay-per-view. That's how they make their money. And, of course, off sponsorships. But a lot of these guys are barely paying off their trainers and all the debts, their training debts and so forth. It's not like one of those things you do for a long career, There's and it has a very short window. But the damage that the guys take, you've heard of fighter dementia, where you get the brain damage and so forth. These guys are taking hits a lot. And there's no way that they're not going to suffer and pay the consequences. Basically, every time they step in the ring, every time they step in the training hall, they're taking years off their life. They're literally shortening their life each time a few minutes, and it all adds up in the end.
And boxing is even worse than MMA because all the hits go to the head.
All the hits go to the head, and now they pad. The gloves are more padded, but that which means that the shot goes right into the brain pan even more. At least with a fist, it's more surface, and you don't quite get the penetration of the big club from the glove. The other thing too, see, people don't just go to the UFC. They have to start at the amateur level, and some of the club fights, the lower level MMA. That's where the real dirty business is going. UFC, once you get to that level, you're a little bit better taken care of. It's more professional. But at the club level, they're literally paying kids like $100 to go in and entertain audiences in these casinos. And these are young, testosterone-filled boys. Sometimes they have poor self-image. They're trying to prove their manhood somehow. Many times these guys have poor father figures. The guys that go in for a lot of times come from poor homes, broken homes. Maybe they're poor. They don't have much else. Sometimes they're not particularly intellectually gifted, so they use their physical skills, what have you. And these promoters take such terrible advantage of these kids. They're paying them peanuts, and they're just in there, for momentary glory, for the adrenaline rush. And I see it as absolutely gross. I was staying in a little town in Washington State called Port Townsend, and there was a casino nearby, and it was on Indian land, and they would pay these local boys from the country to come in. Most of them were horribly trained, not well trained at all, and they would just go in there and just beat the heck out of each other, just total bloody mess. Every Saturday night or so they'd have these fights, and of course the crowd would be drunken booze hounds. They could care less about the skill or the technique or whatever. They just want to see people just pound each other up. And I find that very ugly. It's like taking two pit bull terriers and having them fight. I think it's funny that universally, all over the world, people condemn making two dogs fight, but yet they allow their young men to go into this type of thing.
But at least young men have reason and they can choose to do so.
That is true. People do choose to do so, but sometimes I wonder about the reason.
This is a really interesting topic, and it could be that it is produced by the mass media, which is now throwing out all sorts of macho images. You need to be, if you want to feel like a man, you need to fight in MMA. And UFC is doing a really, really good job of marketing, and they're really world champions in marketing. But there are many, many things that I don't like about them. We'll talk about it a little bit later.